Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Thursday afternoon. It's so good to see so many of you from bright and sunny DC, right? We are here to talk about misinformation today. And it's going to be an interesting conversation. There's lots of different ways to identify misinformation, as well as lots of different ways to be duped by misinformation. And so we're going to be exploring those many different ways of each of those today. I'm joined, as I said earlier, by my colleague, Andrew Kilpa, who I've had the pleasure of working with since I arrived at Byte back. And he's got some great advice to share with you as well on the subject. So let me pull up the presentation, and we will get started. So identifying misinformation in the digital age. Why the digital age? Well, I mean, the fact is that there's always been misinformation out there, right? Ranging from the National Enquirer to other, older periodicals. But today, misinformation moves at a much faster speed, and there's lots of different ways to produce misinformation. And so we're here to discuss that, right, when it comes to finding it online. Going to be joined by Andrew. Looking forward to hearing his insights. But let's get started. Let's just jump right into what we're going to be talking about, right? Which is essentially fake news, right? That's what misinformation is. And it's often stories that contain some truth, but aren't entirely accurate. Sometimes that's by accident. There's an omission on the part of the person who wrote the story. And sometimes it's by design. It's purposefully misleading. And so that can be a problem. Now, the term fake news, it's been around for a while. It's become slightly more politicized over the past several years. And it's used in many cases, though, for people to say news that not necessarily that is fake, but just news that they don't agree with, right? And so we want to kind of, take a step back from that, take a step back from the politicization, from the argumentation, and just say, listen, we are here to talk about what is out there, to provide you the tools that you need to identify what could be qualified as fake news, and to find, more truthful news. So I want to just go through some examples of fake news. So first of all, there is misinformation, right? And that's what's false information that's shared with intention of causing harm. Then there's disinformation, or excuse me, with no intention of causing harm. Then there's disinformation. It's false information that's intended to cause harm, right? And then finally, there's malinformation. And that's true information shared to intentionally cause harm. So there's different types of misinformation. There's different types of fake news out there. Probably the most common that we're used to is misinformation, right? It's false information. People say something, they catch a story, they catch a snippet, and it becomes a game of telephone, so to speak, where, well, I heard this from so-and-so, and so I'm going to now present it to you. And that dilutes the message. There are examples of disinformation and malinformation out there, but probably misinformation is the most common type of fake news you might encounter. So let's see some quack facts, not quick facts, but some quack facts. There was a story recently about a website to help save the Pacific Northwest tree octopus from extinction. Another example, back in 2017, there was apparently a US bacon reserves were at a all-time low. Who knew? I didn't know about that. And finally, some recipes that have been shared on social media are being deemed cures for COVID or ways to prevent contracting COVID, specifically baking soda and lemon juice. So these are just a couple items that are represented, under the banner of misinformation. When it comes to misinformation, do you believe any of these? Did you hear about any of these stories and you said, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's actually going on. We're running low on bacon. What am I going to do for my Saturday breakfast? I don't know. When I saw these, I thought they were pretty far-fetched to begin with, but at the same time, that's how misinformation works. You say, well, maybe it could be true, maybe it's not true, I'm not sure, and then that opens the door. Well, let's look at that website for the Saving the Tree octopus. Here's the website that was talking all about saving the Northwest tree octopus. And even just looking at the website, right, it kind of looks like a homegrown item that someone just kind of created this page randomly to kind of generate almost like a April Fool's joke, right? Then we go to the bacon shortage story, and it turns out that was also fake, There was never any sort of bacon shortage going on in the country that was investigated. And similarly, the bacon soda and lemon juice story, that was also fake, right? And Reuters and a couple other, journalists, they investigated the claim and saw, well, what was the evidence behind it? Was there any evidence behind it? And they identified these things, right? So let's look at these just one by one, right? So the one for the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, that was a joke website. Sometimes stories that you might find on social media, like on Facebook or on Twitter, they link to joke websites just as a ha-ha moment. So you got to be careful about what these websites are. I remember one case in particular where the president of an African country linked to a story saying, look, they're saying that I'm doing a great job, but it was a joke website. Didn't realize that, right? Similarly, sometimes studies are misrepresented, right? Kind of like I said, that game of telephone. That's what happened with the bacon reserves. There was a study done on where the bacon, how much bacon was being produced, and someone misinterpreted the results. And they reported that, and it went viral, right? It spread like wildfire across different social media networks. And suddenly people were getting worried and stockpiling bacon, but for no good reason, right? And that one about the claim about bacon soda and lemon juice, that was medical disinformation, right? Someone said, here, based on my experience, this is good for you. This is going to help you with COVID, but they didn't really actually have any medical studies behind it. There was no doctors who were promoting it. There was nothing it wasn't an evidence-based recipe. It was just somebody's own, proclivity and ideas about that, right? So why do we do this? Why do we fall for misinformation? What makes us vulnerable to misinformation? Well, there's this careful thing called bias. And there's a lot of different kinds of biases out there. I know I have some biases. Andrew has some biases. Everyone, at the end of the day, we're all biased towards something, right? And it's just a matter of being aware of what those biases are. But there are different types of biases, right? There is explicit bias, implicit bias, and confirmation bias. And the reason I want to go over these, the reason I want to review these briefly, is just to let you know and make you aware of how we are biased, because that's really critical to identifying misinformation. And Andrew and I will discuss this later, but a lot of the time when you encounter misinformation online, it exploits your biases. It tries to appeal to what you already believe in, to what you already like, to what you already dislike. And that's how it opens the door to you believing the story that you encounter. So what are these biases? Explicit bias. This is probably the most obvious form of bias, right? These are our outward attitudes and beliefs, things that we hold dearly to ourselves and that we express rightfully, right? So one explicit bias, right, and one of probably the worst biases that we know of is overt racism, prejudiceness, right? People saying, I don't like you for the simple fact that you are this. I don't like you for the simple fact that you are this color, or that you are this religion, or that you are this, other demographic, you are this gender. Explicit bias, right? And that is something that I think most of us are aware of, that we have. If there's an explicit bias that you hold on to, we can see it shape the way that we interact with the world. Now, something more difficult to discern, though, is implicit bias. And this is something that's a bit more tricky because it's just a part of us. It's underneath the surface and we aren't always aware of it, right? These attitudes and beliefs that occur outside of our conscious awareness, right? And it can affect our opinions and our behavior. It can make us say, well, that story is probably true, not realizing that we think it's true. We are leaning towards it being true or false based on something that we're not even aware of that we believe, right? So one example is a hiring manager favoring people with more familiar sounding names. Maybe their name is Steve and they encounter more Steves or more Williams or more other similar sounding names. And they say, I like that person, I'm going to hire them, not realizing that they are gravitating towards names that reflect their own name, right? So that's just one example of implicit bias. And there was actually a study done on this. And I don't have it cited here, but there was a study done several years ago, or a little bit longer than that, where a number of resumes were sent out all across the country with two different names. And the name that sounded more similar to the person who was hiring, the HR manager, that's the name they chose. So this is a trend. This can happen. And finally, there's confirmation bias. No one likes to be wrong. That's just a fact. I know I don't like to be wrong. I know Andrew doesn't like to be wrong. To be fair, Andrew is rarely wrong. So that helps him out. Me, I can be wrong a lot, right? But I don't like it. And so what does that mean? It means I want to find evidence. I want to find the things that back up what I already believe in, right? So if I'm saying, you know what, I think that Bigfoot exists, I'm going to look for stories where Bigfoot has been proven to exist. It doesn't matter all the evidence that Bigfoot doesn't exist. I'm only going to look for those stories that Bigfoot exists, right? I'm looking to confirm my bias that's been developed over the years. Explicit or implicit bias doesn't matter. We are looking for those things to confirm what we believe in, right? And that's really, really meaningful. Now, let me see if there's any questions already out there. Looks like we don't have any questions so far. Feel free to ask questions as we go along about any of these topics. I know that we're going to be, giving some examples later. It looks like Alicia has actually raised her hand.
Yeah, it's not a question, but for example, that I used to, starting in the 1980s, I was working in, EEOC type things to identify bias in textbooks. I work at an educational film company. And the minute I looked at your slide, 2 slides back, it's 2 men talking to each other on those heads. That to me, that's immediate. It's like so many times things are done in terms of men. Like if you go to a doctor's office, every diagram, whether it's your ear or your teeth or whatever, is always men. And some of the women doctors are waking up to this, but I'm just saying it's there all the time. And I noticed it immediately because I was trained to notice that stuff.
That's an excellent point, Alicia. No, that's absolutely true, that sometimes we don't even recognize the bias. Sometimes we don't even recognize the way that things are presented to us that indicates whether it be superiority, more common, it's something making something more commonplace. We have to be aware. It's all around us, right? And it's also, as these slides indicate that we're trying to share with you, it's also within us already, these biases that we might have and hold. So I think that that's an excellent point to raise, that this image and other images, right, is that I'm gonna wag my finger, Andrew, why'd you pick these images? No, we will correct that next time though. We'll try to be more representative. I love that. So just some examples, right, is being selective about where you go for your information, not necessarily seeking out more objective information. Interpretation, making leaps in logic, only remembering the details that reinforce what we want to be confirmed. So let's say back to Bigfoot, let's say I come across a story that says, here's some evidence of Bigfoot, and here's some evidence that Bigfoot isn't real. If I want to confirm my bias, I'm just going to share those facts. I say, hey, look, there's a story and they said Bigfoot is real, and here's the reason why, right? But I'm ignoring, I'm picking and choosing what I want to hear. And also finally, just ignoring the information that can challenge your beliefs as an example of confirmation bias. And that's really important, that we try to let contradictory information in. Otherwise, we can't confirm one way or another. The good thing though about bias, before we get to the specific types, how to identify misinformation, is that it can change, right? We can make changes in ourselves to become more aware of our bias. And that's really where it begins. We need to consider what our biases might be and how bias works, right? How it can embed itself in us over time. How can it embed itself in us with the relationships we have, with the things that we read? And so it's just a matter of kind of trying to take a step back and looking at information with a more objective lens, which I know Andrew is going to be going over shortly. So one thing I'd like to just click on really quick before I hand it over to Andrew, because he's got a lot of great facts of his own to share with you, is this activity by Factitious. So Factitious is a website that tests our ability to choose or to identify bias, and more specifically to identify false information online. And so this is their pandemic edition that we can start. And they have lots of examples of different stories, some of which are false and some of which are not so accurate, right? So it asks us if we can tell the real news from the fake news, right? And so here we are, and it says that a New Jersey woman who gave a fake name and disappeared after testing positive for coronavirus is found. And so we could read through the story and we look at that headline. But one of the other nice things about this game that they provide is you can also check the source of the story. Show the source. Who's the source? and it says the New York Daily News. Well, I think the New York Daily News, that's a pretty respected periodical. I think this is going to make it true story. And I'm going to move it over here. Hey, and we're correct, right? That is a true story from the New York Daily News about a woman suffering from coronavirus who was found. Now we have this other story that Bill and Melinda Gates predicted up to 65 million deaths via coronavirus in a simulation. Oh, that sounds terrible. That sounds really scary. That's a lot of deaths in just 3 months. And let's see what the source is. You know, we read the story, title the event 201, but a highlight reel from the event shows, oh my goodness. Well, let's see the source. And it says InfoWars.
Mark,
InfoWars.
it's not on the screen. Just like,
oh, it's not on the screen?
Yep, it's not on the screen right now.
Oh no.
Yep.
Oh
Yep.
no.
I want to make sure. I was like, it's all good.
Oh, thank you for making me aware of that.
Yeah.
Here, let me go back. Is it on screen now?
Yep, it's on screen.
There we go. So this is the website, and let me actually open it all over again, just so people can see when I click on it where it takes them to. Sorry, folks.
And of course, folks, if you want to play it at home as well,
yes,
it's in the chat.
And so this is what I was referring to, the factitious 2020, where we can actually, you can test your ability to spot real news versus fake news, right? And so this was the first story that we looked at, and you can either go to the right or you can take it to the left based on what you think it is, and then it'll tell you if you're right or if you're wrong. So thank you, Andrew. Sorry about that, everyone. So let's go back to the presentation. And I do recommend that everyone take it, you know, go there, test their knowledge. It's a really fun game, but it's also just a really good exercise. And now I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to pass it over to Andrew.
All right. Thank you, Mark. So, you know, we've already been talking, or we've been introducing this idea of, you know, bias and stories, misleading stories. But where it becomes, I would say, particularly dangerous and particularly easy to get fooled is whenever we see things, right? When you see a video or you see a picture, you're like, well, hey, there's the footage right there, right? How can you refute this footage, right? Well, unfortunately, you know, we do live in an era where it's a lot easier to manipulate and edit videos and photos to serve, you know, a certain purpose, whether it's, you know, positive or negative. And so there's this here idea of false or misleading videos. There are 3 ways that, you know, footage can be altered. And by the way, a lot of this is taken from a Washington Post website, which I will be sharing in the chat as well. So the 3 ways that we have that videos are altered, right? We've got missing context, we've got deceptive editing, and we have malicious transformation. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, and of course, this is the Washington Post website that I was mentioning earlier. I definitely would suggest checking it out. Let me put that in the chat. There we go. Perfect. So let's talk about the first way that videos and footage can be edited. And it's this idea of missing context. It's probably one of the easiest ways, honestly, because it doesn't really require any sort of manipulation of the actual video itself, right? Instead, it's all about spinning the story around the video or the footage that's been shared, right? So it's this idea that the framing lacks or misstates context in which the events occurred, right? So you might share a video and say, this is what's happening right now in, you know, whatever country, when in reality, yeah, that the footage itself is true, but unfortunately, it might have happened 10 years ago, right? That's a very simple way that context can be changed. Here's an example right here, a couple of them. The 2 ways, of course, that context is missing is, of course, misrepresentation. That's what we said, that, you know, the footage itself is unaltered, but it's shown in an inaccurate manner, right? That's the one up here. So this was shared by former President Trump and Representative Gates, right? Where they were saying, oh, look at all these folks trying to come in to cross from Honduras, when in reality, like I said, we're not even sure about the full scope of this footage. But it's very easy to do that, right? It's very easy to take a picture or a video and be like, hey, this is what's happening. So you're changing the narrative. Also isolation, right? Where you're not including the full footage, but instead you cut it at a certain point and you don't show the rest of it. So this one is showing, of course, former President Trump supposedly being snubbed by Steven Strasburg, right? Go Nats. Sorry, any baseball fans, but go. But as you can see, it looks like he's snubbing him, when in reality, he did go and shake his hand later on down the line, right? So that's isolation, right? Where they're not showing the full thing. Another way that video footage can be altered or changed is this idea of deceptive editing. And I think, yep, there you go. And this is where, yeah, the footage has indeed been edited or rearranged. And as we all know, it's become a lot easier for folks to do this, right? Two ways that this can be done. Either they omit something where they just remove, whoever was editing the video will just remove parts of it. And that changes what the story looks like, right? And sometimes it can even be as small as a few seconds of footage, but those small seconds can really change the story, right? And then also splicing, where they combine footage together. And that also changes the narrative. So let's take a look at some examples here. Here's some omission right there. This is a pretty infamous one where it looks like this person has nothing to say, right? They cut away immediately before this other politician can say anything. And so it's like, oh, no, this guy doesn't have any plan. Look at him stumbling with his words, not even answering this reporter. When in reality, they just omitted the parts that he said. And then if we go down to splicing is, of course, combining footage together, and it makes it once again look like, in this case, this is Senator Lindsey Graham, where, it says here, it looks like he's endorsing the Green New Deal. And all they did was they just took footage from one press conference, combined it with footage from another, right? And it doesn't look that different at all because, of course, he's wearing the same thing, but it's different footage. Right, so that's splicing, where you're combining footage together. And then the last one, and I think this is probably the one that, in my opinion, is probably the most alarming, simply because it's become more and more prevalent, is this idea of transforming the footage. It's literally changing the footage itself, right? I'm sure some of you have heard this idea of deep fakes that are being shared online. Some of them are kind of funny, of course. Some of them are used more for comedic purposes, like, oh, okay, Tom Cruise, right, swapping his face with another actor, right, in a movie, right? You can actually get various apps on your phone that let you do deep fakes, most, just for fun, of course. But when we're talking about malicious transformation, it literally means manipulating the whole video and changing things outright. So here's one. This is doctoring, where they've literally doctored this video. This is from a music video, but it looks like he's holding up a picture of President Joe Biden, right? So that literally has been doctored to appear this way. And you saw it's relatively flawless how they did this. And then another way that videos can be maliciously transformed, of course, is fabrication. This is where deepfake AI is being used to quite literally change very simply, like changing the faces, for instance, of people who are speaking. So it's important to be aware, like I said, of all these different ways that video and, also pictures can be changed to try to get you to feel a certain way about something. Now, the question is, right, with all this, all this stuff we just discussed, right? We just talked about, okay, false news articles or misinformation or even altered video, right? How can we separate the real from the fake, right? I'm sure that's the question. That's why we're all here today, right? And we've got a couple steps. We've got actually eight strategies, 8 ways to spot fake news. And let's take a look at the first one. So the first point, and by the way, this source that we have here, this is from the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, as well as factcheck.org. I think one of the things that's important is to, of course, consider the source, right? I'm not just saying this. I'm not just telling you guys all this. Both Mark and I, we are citing our sources. So if you want to take a look at it yourself, yeah, by all means. But it's very, very important that, whenever anyone makes a claim, it's like, well, where is this from? So that's one of the first things you can always ask yourself, always, is what is the source, right? And as they're mentioning here, it's important to click away from the story, right? especially if it's a story that's making you, feel a certain way, especially if you're angry about something. I think that's something that tends to drive a lot of things like that. Anything with emotion. So before you start, sharing that story, like, oh my gosh, can you believe this? Consider where it's from. What's the source? Another thing to think about, right? Read beyond, as we said before, just like I said earlier, a lot of these headlines on a lot of, especially online headlines, they are designed to make you feel a certain way. It generates clicks, it generates revenue, so it's important to always ask yourself, what is the full story? Read the full story, right? Check the author. That's another crucial thing, right? It's not that difficult these days to do a search on the author and look at their credentials. Are they a credible source? Do they actually know what they're talking about, right? If they say that they've got a PhD in something, you can do a quick check and say, like, is this verifiable, right? Supporting sources, you're always going to ask yourself, click on those actually links and determine if the sources, if the info in there actually supports the story, right? A lot of times they'll have citations. Hopefully, it doesn't hurt to check up, follow up on those citations. Let's look at the next one. Now, Mark, do you have anything to add? Okay. All right, no worries. So yeah, other things that you can do.
There we go. I'm sorry.
There we go.
The menu
No worries.
bar for me to unmute was not populating. Sorry about that.
No worries.
If I can just take it from here, Andrea, there's all
sure.
good points, and these are some more that I just want to review. To Andrew's point, and I want to acknowledge one thing. There's a lot of things here that you can do, and I recognize that a lot of these can be, if you do all of these, it can be time consuming. No one wants to do all of these different steps necessarily just to check one story, right? But I do recommend you do at least do some of these steps, especially if you're going to be sharing this story with a friend, with a loved one, with your social network, just because the fact is that, as Andrew pointed out, there's so many different ways to create misinformation, whether it be written word or video. There's so many different ways. And so it's now more than ever, it's important to check your facts, or to check the facts that you find in these stories, right? And so one thing that you can do also is check the date. I've made this mistake before. Someone shared an old story that really got my blood boiling. I said, I can't believe that happened. Well, it turns out it happened 2 years ago. It turns out that it was old news that had just been reused to generate clicks, and I fell for it. So check the date when the original story was published. Another thing, and this was noted in one of the first examples that we gave, right, about the tree octopus. Is it a joke? Does it sound too fantastical to be true? Sometimes it is. Check out the website. If you see other stories that are just as absurd, then you're going to be on the right path, and you're going to say, oh, this is clearly a fake news website or web source. Check your biases, and we discussed these, right? Your explicit, your implicit, your bias towards finding information that enforces your belief systems. Check your biases. And to the point that Andrew made earlier, one of the clearest ways you can find not necessarily fake news, but news that has a certain degree of misinformation in it is when you start to get angry, or when you start to really be worried about what the outcome is. Because typically speaking, news is meant to be objective, right? That's how it's presented, or that's how I learned it in school. News is meant to be objective. Here are the facts, and then you do what you want with the facts. But more and more often, there is little tidbits that are sprinkled in with the facts. So just make sure to check your biases. And another one is also ask the experts, right? Ask a librarian, or you can consult a fact-checking website, right? There are different websites, and we're going to share a couple of those with you in a moment. One last thing that I think is also important when it comes to spotting fake news, and this isn't included in our list, but it is relevant, is there an ask? A lot of fake news stories, a lot of misinformation is pointing you in the direction of taking a certain action. Either that direction is to attend a rally, donate to a certain organization or to a company, to write a congressman. If there is an ask in that article that you're reading, then typically speaking, it's meant for a purpose. It's misinformation, or there's a certain degree of misinformation in there. And so when you see that ask, you should say to yourself, wait a minute, how real is this story? Why is this, here? So just something to be aware of.
Yeah, Mark, and if I might also add, I would also say it's also important, some of it might actually be also true, but it might just be an opinion, right? And I think that a lot of folks, they get confused in that. They don't notice the little opinion or editorial tagline, even if it's from a trusted source like a newspaper that is verifiable, right? A lot of folks are like, I can't believe this story. Well, it's not really a story, it's an opinion, right? So I think that's another thing to keep in mind, right?
Absolutely.
The differences between news stories, which are meant to be just the facts, neutral, and then an opinion piece, which does, which is also providing facts, which is also citing, which might also be written by someone who is, who knows their field, but they do have an ask. They do have an agenda there, right?
Absolutely.
So keep those in mind.
That's a great point, Andrew. Thank you. So to share or not to share, right? And we already gave you a couple of tips as to why maybe you want to take some steps prior to sharing. And I think, Andrew, if you can share the 5 W's, that'd be great.
Sure. All right. So the 5 W's that we have here, many of you are familiar with these, but we've added kind of a spin on that. So they're what, why, who, when, and where. So let's break it down. What? First one. What kinds of false content should I watch out for? So you're going to ask yourself, like, is this even true? That's the first thing, right? First question. Second one, why? Why is it being spread around? Right? Just like what Mark was mentioning, if it's starting to make your blood boil, check yourself. Check why is that, right? Who is spreading it, right? Who is sharing? Who is sharing all these posts? Do they have a good track record for accuracy? When did it start spreading, right? This might be a true story, but if this is something that happened 10 years ago, right? You might want to ask yourself that. And then finally, where else can I find out if something is real, right? Always look, and once again, this is referring to this idea of checking your sources, checking other sources besides the one that you're looking at to see if anything else can verify that. So those are our 5 W's: what, why, who, when, and where. What we have here is a collection of fact-checking sites. These are all impartial organizations that have strived to actually go and verify and do the research for various news items and stories. Probably one of the most well-known ones is, of course, is factcheck.org, right? That's an example right there. This is what their website. They actually do look at various claims on both, on all the different political parties. They're not biased. So that's factcheck.org.
And here, just to point something out, factcheck.org will give you some very popular stories that are circulating and let you know in real time, what's going on with those stories and whether they should be trusted or not. And we were talking about earlier about selective editing. There is a story here about a particular video clip of the CDC director, right? And sees unedited clip. It's an edited clip that's being circulated, right? So it's not necessarily giving the full story of what was said by the CDC director. So that just is just an example of things that you need to be aware of. But back to the slides.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Other sites, obviously, media bias / fact check. That's mediabiasfactcheck.com. There's PolitiFacts, which tends to explore more obviously in a more political side of things, where we already definitely know bias is on all sides. It's Snopes.com, which explores a wide variety of things, whether it's emails that are shared, or social media posts, or video, or just ideas that are kind of floating around in the internet.
Or even rumors like this
or
one.
rumors,
The
yeah.
infrastructure bill requires surveillance systems in new vehicles to track drivers. Well, that's something I want to know. I don't want to
Yeah.
be tracked, right? But does
Yeah.
it? Is that accurate? You'll have
Right.
to go here to click to find out. We're not going to tell you that. You go to Snopes.com later.
So yeah, Snopes.com is a great site for that. And also, I just want to point your attention towards a tool called the Washington Post Fact Checker. I think we might have skipped that real quick.
Sorry.
Yep, thank you.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So the Washington Post Fact Checker is another really useful tool, I think. Let's take a look at that real quick. There we go. Yep. And once again, that's another, this is the Washington Post's own resource that goes into all kinds of stories, right? So you notice they're all tagged with analysis. So yeah, another very good website. A lot of their stuff, of course, is also going to be politically focused because, well, that's, like I said, that's where a lot of bias can be found.
Yeah. One thing to note, though, so they have this Pinocchio scale. The more Pinocchios you get, as you might imagine, the bigger the lie. But they'll explain why they gave X amount of Pinocchios. In some cases, I've seen stories where they say this is just a one Pinocchio because the person gave all the right facts, but the conclusion they came to based on the facts was a little bit off, contradicted what experts were saying, right? So, it's an interesting read, to say the least, if you go here. But I think they're all great resources that Andrew is sharing and suggesting, including this next one.
Yep. So this is actually something that you can get for your browser if you have Google Chrome. So this is the official media bias fact check icon. And the way that it works is that if you're on a certain website and you look at this extension, it actually will show you an icon that lets you know what is the political bias for this particular page. So this is going to be a good way of, to allow you to kind of identify, if they might have any kind of, once again, a bias. So I think we'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah,
for those who want to check that out.
I think it's fair, and let's be honest about the media. All media outlets, to a certain degree, right? They have an agenda. They are appealing to a certain audience, right? That's how they are able to generate revenue a lot of the time. So all media outlets will have an agenda and have a certain bias tilting one direction or another, right? How far that tilt goes can vary widely. There can be a little bit of tilt, or there can be a lot of tilt in one direction or the other. And so this tool just kind of gives you an indication of where that tilt is, how far that tilt might actually be, right? But even so, even if you get and the reason I make that point is that you should still, no matter what your news resource is, use these tools. Not these tools particularly, but I use these strategies that we have for identifying misinformation. Whether you're going to a very reputable news source or you're going to something with a little bit more opinion, just use the strategies to identify misinformation, and you should still be able to get the truth, to extrapolate, what is true versus what is maybe a stretch of the truth.
Absolutely. We also have a website here that's it's called Fake News Detector AI. And actually, the way it works is that you can link a news article into this fake news detector AI, and it will pretty much generate an output that lets you kind of know, like, hey, like this is a questionable source, right? So, like I said, very, very useful additional tool that you can use. And let me put that in the chat as well. There we go. If you wanna, for those who want to check that out.
And before, Andrew, sorry to interrupt, just before we keep going, because I know that we've covered a lot of ground already and we're getting to the official Q&A section of our conversation, I'm wondering, are there questions that you might have about these tools, about the strategies that we mentioned, about anything that we've discussed so far? Any questions out there?
Looks like Alicia.
Yes. Alicia, what's your question?
Sorry, I just want to know, like when somebody sends something through the chat, how do you then transfer that to be an email or a text so I can keep it. Otherwise I have to take a picture of it, and I don't want to take a picture of your stuff if it's copyrighted or something.
No. So that's an excellent question. One thing we can do is we can share these slides with you after.
Oh, good.
As long as we should have access to your email since you registered through the for the today's presentation, so we can email that to you. We also share the slides with WildTech, who arranges for these presentations, so they have access to that. And there's also a recording of the presentation that's sent out, so you don't have to worry about missing anything, especially for those anyone in the audience who arrived late. Don't worry, you will get a recording of the video via email.
Thank you. I have one other thing.
Sure.
Yesterday, Teresa was teaching us a cybersecurity second course, and she mentioned it should be HTTPS, or we should turn around and make a U-turn. And two of your sites have just HTTP with no S.
Thank you for pointing that
one.
Huh?
Yeah.
Factitious has one like that.
Yeah.
With no S.
Let me double check that. Yeah, I think you're right in that regard. That's on them. That's on the website. Actually, they need to put HTTPS on that. But I can say, so. Yeah, I can say at least that that is a trustworthy site, at least from what I've seen. But
okay,
you're absolutely correct though. In the website, they have not done their due diligence. Okay. So I might actually send a message to them and be like, hey, what's up with this? So
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other questions, folks?
All right, well, seeing none, we can go over some of these other tools. The PolitiFacts questionnaire, Andrew?
Yes, so this is actually another really helpful site. And if essentially it's a 10-question questionnaire, and you can kind of apply to any article or video that you're looking at, right? And it's through, of course, PolitiFacts, which we have already just mentioned earlier. So let's actually, can we take a look at that for a moment, please, Mark? And I'll put that in the chat as well. There we go. Okay, so it says here, real or fake, take our fake news quiz to find out. So essentially the way that this works is that it asks you 10 questions, right? So after you've looked at some kind of article, you can kind of apply these questions to yourself, right? And so the first one, of course, it's saying like, hey, use caution. So have you heard of the website where the story appears? It seems like a simple question, but if you haven't ever heard of the website before, that might be something to think about, right? And so it's going to be a yes or a no. Another thing to ask about the source itself, is there a clear about us page? Yes or no, right? So like I said, as you're kind of looking at a story, you can apply these different questions to that. So yeah, is there a clear about us page? Yes or no. If it doesn't have that, then that might be questionable. Does the story contain a clearly attributed source or sources? Once again, yes or no, right? So as you're looking through your article, you can say, okay, yeah, it looks like they're citing their sources. You can put yes. Is the story being reported by other reputable outlets? Yes or no, right? Hopefully it's like yes, but once again, you can even put I don't know if you really don't know yet. This is another one where there should be red flags, right? If there are significant just spelling errors all over the place or grammar errors, once again, yes or no. Hopefully, a real journalist would actually care about things like this. Does the story have a date on it, right? So you're like, okay, is this recent? Is this new? Yes or no? Is there something odd about the URL? So once again, kind of Alicia was mentioning earlier, right? Ideally, if it's ABC News, you should actually be at ABC News, right? Though if the website says ABC News, but the URL doesn't mention that, that's questionable. Photos, right? If there's any photos, are they credited? Once again, yes or no. Is the story's writer clearly identified with a byline and contact information? Once again, yes or no. Are official documents or specific citations in a story actually about the subject, right? this is another thing to also remember. Someone might be able to like, oh yeah, we've got citations, right? But if you follow up in those citations and they have nothing that has to do with the story, that's another questionable thing, right? And so the idea is that once you've, done all your questions, and this website will tally it up and tell you, hey, there are some warning flags, or it'll say, oh wow, steer clear, right? Depending on whatever source that you're looking at. So that's a lovely little 10 question questionnaire that you can apply really to almost any source that you find.
Well, one thing to point out, and I know that we said earlier, check the dates. So this is a good example of that. In this case, the check the date, right? Here's the author, June 19th, 2017 is when this useful tool was created. Does that mean this tool is outdated? Does that mean this tool is somehow misleading? No, in this instance, because these are just general questions to ask about your article or your whatever the story is that you're reading about. If it were something a little different, right, as sometimes it can be, oh, Biden did this, this happened in the news, there's a hurricane off the coast of wherever, then it's more relevant to time constraints. But in this case, we just want to make sure that I want to make sure that you recognize that the date here doesn't in any way impact what you might use this tool for.
Yeah, thank you. Good point, Mark. Thank you.
So as far as steps to stopping fake news, your own consumption of it, sharing it with friends and family, maybe even, avoiding it on social media, there's a couple of key steps that you can take based on the strategies we shared, based on the tools that we shared with you, right? And the first one, and it seems pretty simple, but it's probably the most important, right? Because everything else flows from this first step, which is think critically. Every story you read, not just, even it's from a trusted website, a trusted news source, you've been reading them for years, a trusted journalist, every story you read, you should be evaluating it critically, using the strategies that we discussed, right? And so you're reading it and you're thinking about it critically, and you say, well, okay, the source, I trust the source, great. You don't necessarily have to check the source. If it's new though, you might still want to, you definitely want to check the source. Can it be corroborated? And usually a really easy way to corroborate a story is just as this suggests, see who else is reporting it. Is the story being reported on, that's on CNN, being reported on Fox, being reported on MSNBC, being reported on Reuters? And if there's any difference in those stories, if you notice a difference and you say, hey, wait a minute, that story here in this headline doesn't appear to be the exact same story here in this headline, chances are someone's reporting it differently for a reason. Okay, maybe they're both reporting it differently for a reason, but at least one news source is reporting it differently for a reason. Okay, so corroboration is one good way to check stories. Examining the evidence, as we mentioned earlier, are there citations? Are there experts being cited? What is the dates? How recently was the story? Examining the information, questioning the pictures, right? And as Andrew pointed out, pictures and even videos now can be manipulated to skew a story, right? So be questioning about those pictures. Don't just assume that video you saw of Lindsey Graham where he's endorsing the Green New Deal is correct. Don't assume that video or it looks like President Trump has been snubbed is accurate. Don't assume that picture, that video of Nancy Pelosi mincing her words or acting like she's speaking like she's incoherent is accurate. Check to see what's being reported on other websites and if those videos are popping up, because I guarantee if that's a big story on wherever you are, wherever you're visiting, it should be a big story elsewhere, and you'll be able to do a compare and contrast. And finally, as was pointed out, grammar and spelling, if you keep seeing a lot of mistakes, that's a surefire way, that something's going on, right?
Red flags.
But once again, think critically. That is the biggest step you can take. So that is the end of our presentation. But now we are, open for questions. We'd love to hear back from you. Any thoughts and any questions that you have about this topic? Don't be shy. We're all family here.
Or if you prefer to ask it in the chat, there is a chat feature. If you
Yes.
prefer to type it instead, feel free to do that as well.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Cheryl.
Hello.
Fascinating presentation. I'm sitting here wondering, so do I kind of not want to be editor of print media? Or do I now have to worry what I read can be kind of like taken as fact? You know what I mean? Gone are the days when I would run, you know, you run to the paper to get the full story.
Yeah, of course.
So that's no longer a thing.
No, you can still run to the paper. Absolutely. I think that it's just a matter of, as Andrew pointed out, right? In papers, there are sections for news stories and there are sections for editorials. That line gets blurred online more easily. In paper, it's usually very easy to say, oh, this is the story. Oh, look in the back section. Here we have the editorials, right? They have that usually separated. That's clear enough. That's not so easy to discern online, and especially not so easy to discern when you're watching a nightly news show, because in some nightly news shows, there's a lot of opinion that can be sprinkled over the actual news. So it's just a matter of, like, you know, we've said, you have to think critically, you have to evaluate the information and see what is just a fact and what is making you think or feel a certain way, what is driving you towards something, right? So no, I think, yes, absolutely, print media, getting that morning paper, that's fine, but you just need to, even with the morning paper, just be a little careful and be mindful of where you are in that paper.
Yeah, and I would also add, I would say the bigger risk is also, of course, social media, where it's very easy for anyone to just share anything and just say it's fact. Just say it's fact without any, you know, just like we mentioned before, any kind of corroboration, without any kind of knowledge, just to be like, this is what's really happening. Very, you know, I could just do it right now. And it's
one of my
terrible.
favorite memes that I saw on Facebook was, you can't trust anything you read on the internet, and the name that it was attributed to was Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Right. And but that's indicative of how the internet works, right? If you're not checking your sources, if you're not, you know, thinking critically, you can be duped. If you're not looking to, you know, for those different telltale signs of what might be fake versus real, you can be duped. So it's just a matter of being careful.
Yeah.
Because,
it really is. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Was that true?
On YouTube, I'm a big YouTube fan. So they put a thumbnail, especially if you have your favorite person that you follow. And I follow this guy who's very interested in antique cars and restoring cars. Yesterday's one was, I took my car away from my son. He bought his son a fancy car. I just took my car away from my son. So you had to go to the whole YouTube thing of 15 minutes. And it had nothing to do with him taking the car away from his son. And I know not to fall for it, but you're kind of like, oh, he bought this, you know, so many dollars on this car, and he took it away from us, so we want to see what happened. He spoke totally about something else, and they get me all the time. Fake news.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you brought up YouTube, Cheryl, because this also brings up kind of something we've been discussing. Things like YouTube, they tend to say it, you know, it has a whole algorithm where it's like, oh, you notice that you watched this, so we're going to add more things that are similar, right? This kind of helps with that whole idea of bias, right? Because it pretty much keeps you insulated into like, oh, these are only things that are true because the only things that I'm seeing on YouTube, right? So it's another important thing to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Of course. Sure. Alicia, yes.
Yeah, one last thing. When you showed the browser, the extension to the Chrome browser, could you show that again? Because it looked kind of complicated, like how you have to get into it. What was it called? It was some kind of fact checker. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I'll also put the link in the chat as well. Yeah, so for folks who are not as familiar, a browser extension is a special tool that you can install into your browser that gives your browser additional features, additional functions.
But do you have to ask them for that, or where do you find that?
So as soon as you click on it, it'll actually take you to the download, and
Okay,
you can add that to Chrome.
okay,
Yeah, and then of course, once you're in an art, and the way that it works is that when you're like in an article, you can kind of click on that little browser icon, and it will kind of give you some information about that particular source.
well, that's fabulous. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
of course.
That's great.
Yeah.
So just to be very clear, and I'm gonna click on that one more time. Let me share my screen one more time. So here's my screen, and I'm going to click on this one more time. When it takes you to the link, you have to be in Chrome.
Right, I'm in Chrome. I have Chrome.
Yeah, but
Yep.
perfect. I just want to make that explicit, that like Andrew, reiterate that point. So you can't be using Firefox. You can't be using any other web search tools. It needs to be Chrome that you're using. So otherwise you won't have that same tool. And also for those of us who don't want to wait for the slides to be shared or the video recording, the way I always find these things is just to Google it. I go to Google and I say, let's see, what would be a good thing?
Media bias,
Media
fact check.
bias, or even media bias tool, Google.
Yeah.
And there it is, the fact check extension. First thing comes right up, right?
Great.
So if you forget what it is, just Google it.
Great, thank you so much. That's really valuable.
Mhm. Yeah, and of course, if you want to, if you're also unsure of it yourself, you can look at the reviews. You can look at others. Like I said, if you don't trust it, that's totally fine. You can do your research and say like, hey, I want to take a look at this before I actually install it into your browser. I think that's totally valid, honestly.
Yvonne, what's your question?
It's more of a comment.
Sure.
A comment I have to make.
Please.
And that is, being what it is, this technology, anytime you use it, somehow they're going to find out a little something about you.
Yeah.
Now, for an example, YouTube, we just talked about that.
Mhm.
I spend maybe 2 hours every other day on YouTube watching things that are of interest to me.
Mhm.
And you're right. What they will do is that they'll learn what you are,
Yeah.
watching and put more of it there, or suggest something similar, whatever. Also, if you Google anything, that's another way they can get information from people who Google,
Yeah.
Asking different questions and this and that and the other. So there's really no way to avoid being used, and I use that in a special kind of way of being used, but to the extent that which you can protect yourself, I think this is a great class and a great, I appreciate what the two of you are offering.
Thanks, Yvonne. And to that point, just to share with everyone, right? I think that's a really important point that you make, which is that YouTube, Facebook, a lot of different social media outlets are designed to appeal to confirmation bias.
Yeah.
The algorithms are actually built to continue feeding you what you're already looking at.
Exactly.
Right? And so that only, sends you further down whatever rabbit hole you might already be down, right? So you might have started with, is Betty White dead? Right? And then they show you all these stories about Betty White. And then suddenly there's a story about Betty White. She just faked her death and she's actually on a beach in Tahiti. You're like, oh, really? And then you start down that story. And then suddenly it's how she's, this is just a made up example, but this is kind of how it can work. Right. And so we need to be, and this goes back to that original point that, it's all about thinking critically and being aware of our own biases when we're consuming this information. Absolutely.
And everyone has the right to participate or not. I don't participate in social media at all. Instagram and this and that. I just don't do it. You call me.
I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
Other comments or questions or thoughts that you all would like to share? We have, I think we have about 10 more minutes left.
Oh, so much from this.
All right.
I have one more question.
Sure, please.
Sure, yes.
Does clearing the browser after every time get rid of the algorithm? Because I went on a couple of times, I looked at something about Prince Charles or something. I mean, just now I get nothing but these fat things about the royal family. I don't want any of that, you know, and
It depends where you are. And this is why I say that. And Andrew, you know, please, you know, I believe you know a little bit more about this than I do. But if you're in Facebook and you
I
might
don't
do
use
a
any of that. I don't use anything.
okay.
YouTube.
So just in the browser itself, if you do a search, it will register. The only way you can try to get around that is if you're in like a incognito mode, which, you know, I know that, you know, Google Chrome has, I know that Apple Safari has, where you can be blind. But even so, I think there's still a way to track that sometimes. Andrew?
Yeah, sure. So I would add, and this is a valid concern. I would say for those of you who don't like the idea of, you know, all of your searches being known by an organization, because let's be real, you know, whenever you use Google, which is a household name now, but we, you know, remember it is a company, right? And they will be getting something from what we do on it. If you don't feel comfortable with that, there are some alternatives. I think probably one of the biggest ones that I always suggest to folks if they don't feel comfortable using Google as a search engine, there's something called DuckDuckGo.
Yeah, I'm on that. Yeah, I use that.
Yeah. So for those of you not familiar, they are it's another search engine, except they do not track or store information. That's not their purpose. At least that's what they say, but it's been verified. So I think we can agree with that. But yeah, they're kind of like the anti-Google in that regard, where they don't store information. So for those of you who are concerned about that, I think that can be a helpful tool.
And did you say it's called Duck, like DUCK?
Yes.
So DuckDuckGo.
DuckDuckGo. Actually, I have it on my screen right now. For those who want to take a look, this is what it looks like. DuckDuckGo.
It's great.
And yeah, so they provide some privacy. They're a private search engine, and like I said, their whole thing is they are not about storing your search history or anything like that. So yeah, I would say for those of you who are concerned, and it's a valid concern, it's worth a shot.
Yeah, but it just said there, add DuckDuckGo to Chrome. Chrome was owned by Google. Why would anybody want to do that?
Also true. Well, I mean, I think they're talking about, it's an extension. So let me actually show you that so that we can. Yeah. So when you click on that link, it actually allows you to add the DuckDuckGo privacy extension to your Chrome browser. Now, if you don't even feel comfortable using the Google Chrome browser, there's of course alternative browsers that are out there. I would say probably the most popular one is of course Firefox. That's probably the most well-known one that does not also collect information. It's not held by a large organization, you know, like a lot of the other browsers that are popular out there.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say Firefox is a good one to use.
But the other thing is that I used to use incognito all the time on Chrome. And then I noticed in the privacy policy it says, we don't let anybody track you but us. So everything you do on incognito, like medical, they keep everything that's in incognito.
Yeah.
Now Firefox, is that Chrome?
No, so Firefox is by another group called Mozilla, and they're a nonprofit organization.
Okay.
Yeah,
and they're safer.
I'm not going to say that they're safer or not safer, but they do not. They're not as intent about gathering information.
Right, as Google is.
As Google, yeah, Google will be gathering information
all the time.
Yeah,
24/7.
That's part of their business. Yeah, that's part of their business.
They're probably gathering information on us all right now. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Thanks for thanks for Firefox, because I'd seen that but didn't look into it to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
I'm gonna, you know what, actually, since we do have some time, Mark, if this is okay, I do want to show one more thing that I think can be helpful.
Please, yeah.
Especially for Google users, because I know there's issues with privacy that I'm sure many of us are concerned about.
Yes.
So let me just share my screen for a second. So where I'm at, of course, I'm saying this as a person who does use Google. As I will say that right now. I mean, I'm on Google Chrome and I'm in my Gmail and all that. But if you log into your Gmail, if you click on your account, so as an example, and so please no judgment because I have like a billion emails. So when I log into my Google account, I just got cast in something. That's cool. You can right click on your account and you go to your management. You can manage your account, right? You see what I just did? So when you go up to this top right corner, now I have my picture in mind, but most likely if you're in your Google account, it'll be your initials for whatever your email address is, right? When you click on this and then go to manage your account, right? You can go to data and privacy, and you can actually look at some of your privacy settings. And I would say if you'd like, go through all of them. Now, for me, I'm comfortable with them having my info like this. But if you don't like that, you can actually go in, and these, as you can see, I've gone to data and privacy, and they have all this information here, all the history settings. If you don't like that, you can turn them off. So that's something I would suggest for anyone here who is not comfortable with the idea of Google having information like this. You can actually go in and change these settings yourself for each of your accounts. And the thing is, and I don't know if they necessarily advertise this too much, ironically enough, but like I said, you can go in, and the same thing also applies to social media. If you are on social media, and like I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with being on social media. I say this as a person who's on all of them, but it's important to, if you are on social media, it's important to be aware of all the settings that are there. So even like Facebook, Twitter, all of them also have data and privacy settings that you can go in and modify and change. I would wager that not many people have gone into these types of settings or even are aware that such settings exist. So yeah, and notice it even applies to things like location history. If you wanna get really spooked out, I'm comfortable with sharing some of this stuff, but since I use Google Maps, it actually tracks all the locations I've ever been using Google Maps. It might be, like I said, it can be terrifying if you're not counting on that happening. But as you can see, there's YouTube history, there's location history, there's web and app activity. These are all, for me, on. But if you don't like that idea, please, by all means, go and turn them off because they're going to be on by default. So actually, let me just show location history really quick. So yeah, as you can see, location history, I can turn that off. I'm not going to turn it off because I am okay with that. I'm personally okay with that because I know already ahead of time. But like I said, if you want to turn that off, please turn that off.
Andrew, thank you for reminding me of these options, and also for pointing out that every major social media and or brand, will have options like these security options where you can actually control how much.
Here's an example, folks. They know I've been here.
Oh,
they know all the places I've been. But for me, I think it's kind of cool. Yeah. But for some folks, I know that can be terrifying.
Yeah.
So I totally understand. It's like, okay, now where was I on December 29th? See, I like it because it's a nice little alibi for anything. I'm kidding. That's terrible. But as you can see, it knows my route, the route I took to go to different locations.
Wow.
So you can, this is something that because I'm using their app.
So,
right?
That brings us to the end of our presentation. Yeah. Thank you for terrifying everyone now, Andrew.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
But also thank you for everyone for attending today, for asking the questions that you did, for participating, engaging, making suggestions. We really appreciate your input, your feedback, your participation, and we're happy to continue working with you all. So please be on the lookout for an email from WildTech that will have the slides, that will have a link to this recording. And feel free to share with your own friends and family if you think that any of the information that you've heard today was valuable. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you all again next month in February. So take care, everyone.
I want to stay safe, everybody.
Thank
you.
Thank you so much. It was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.